Hello everyone, this is the lesson 2 of our subject, disaster readiness and risk reduction. We have exposure and vulnerability. By the end of this discussion, you're expected to enumerate elements exposed to hazards, explain the meaning of vulnerability, explain why certain sectors of society are more vulnerable to disaster than others, analyze why certain structures are more vulnerable to specific hazards than others, conduct hazard hunts of exposed elements and propose corresponding corrective actions for one's preparedness, determine the elements that are exposed to a particular hazard, recognize vulnerabilities of different elements exposed to specific hazards, and lastly, differentiate among hazards, exposures, and vulnerabilities, and give examples from actual situations. Let us start our discussion by defining exposure. So when we say exposure, it refers to the presence of people, livelihood, environmental services and resources, infrastructure or economic, social or cultural assets in places that could be adversely affected by physical events and which thereby are subject to potential future harm, loss, and damage. It may be possible to be exposed but not vulnerable. So here are the examples of exposure. Elements exposed to hazards. When we say hazard, it is a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. Physical hazard is defined as a factor within the environment that can harm the body without necessarily touching out. For examples, vibration and noise. Other examples, we can have moving machinery accidents, slipping, hitting devices, and projectiles. Working with moving machinery can be dangerous, particularly if that machinery is in poor state of repair and employees have not received adequate training. Moving machinery accident claims typically related to injuries on hands, fingers, limbs, and the eyes. Slips happen where there is too little friction or traction between the footwear and the walking surface. Common causes of slipping are wet or oily surfaces, occasional spills, weather hazards if it is raining, loose anchored rugs or mats, and floor or other walking surfaces that do not have same degree of traction in all areas. Heating devices may cause personal injury in burns from hot surfaces, liquids, vapors, or flames. It may also be a source of ignition both from hot surfaces, liquids, or flames and from electrical components. Projectiles may cause health effect which could be lacerations, bruising, breaks, eye injuries, and a possible death. Social hazard, also known as cultural hazard. It is a result from your location, your socio-economic status, occupation, and your behavioral choices. Economic hazard refers to the major natural disasters which can do and have severe negative short-run economic impacts. Environmental hazard refers to state of events which has the potential to threaten the natural environment and adversely affect people's health. Vulnerability to specific hazard. When we say vulnerability, it is the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. There are many aspects for vulnerability, arising from various physical, social, economic, and environmental factors. Examples may include poor design and construction of buildings, inadequate protection of assets, lack of public information and awareness, or being not informed or unaware of what is happening around you. Limited official recognition of risks and preparedness measures, and disregard for wise environmental management. Vulnerability varies significantly within a community and over time. This definition identifies vulnerability as a characteristic of the element of interest, which is independent of its exposure. Physical vulnerability can be determined by aspects such as population density levels, remoteness of a settlement, the site design, and materials used for critical infrastructure and for housing. For example, physical vulnerability is wooden homes are less likely to collapse in an earthquake but are more vulnerable to fire. Another example is wooden homes can easily be damaged when there is a typhoon compared to a home that is built by using stronger materials. Social vulnerability refers to the inability of people, organizations, and societies to withstand adverse impacts of hazards due to characteristics inherent in social interactions, institutions, and system of cultural values. Example, when flooding occurs, some citizens, such as children, elderly, and differently able, may be unable to protect themselves or evacuate if necessary. Economic vulnerability is a level of vulnerability that is highly dependent upon the economic status of individuals, community, and nations. The poor are usually more vulnerable to disasters because they lack the resources to build sturdy structures and put other engineering measures in place to protect themselves from being negatively impacted by disaster. Okay. Example, we have poorer families may live in squatter settlements because they cannot afford to live in safer or more expensive areas. Environmental vulnerability. Natural resources depletion and resource degradation are key aspects of environmental vulnerability. Example is the Caroni Swamp, which is a wetland. It is sensitive to increasing salinity from seawater and pollution from stormwater runoff that contains agricultural chemicals, eroded soils, and many more. Now let us identify the vulnerable sectors. The first sector is agriculture and food. The agriculture sector in the Philippines is highly dependent on a constant water supply and unpredictable growing seasons. Climate-related changes disrupt farming activities and hamper agricultural production, resulting physical factors. Watersheds, forestry, biodiversity, and water resources. Major river basins in the Philippines are considered the lifeblood of the Philippine economy. However, because of the pollution, unstable resource use, and additional pressure brought on by climate change, these areas have become less viable. Example of watersheds in Luzon. Here we have the Abra River Basin. In Mindanao, we have the Central Cebu River Basin. And in Mindanao, we have the Agusan River Basin. These are just some of the river basins found in the Philippines. The third vulnerable sector is the coastal and marine resources. Even without climate change, many parts of the Philippines coasts were already getting damaged and deteriorating due to natural causes of human-induced activities. Here are examples of human-induced activities like throwing garbage, dynamite fishing, and stepping on the corals. So through this activity, these organisms can be damaged. The next sector is human health. Infectious diseases that are climate sensitive become vulnerabilities of a population that is threatened by the increasing frequency of extreme climate events. Other diseases have re-emerged or have become harder to treat. Here are some of the factors that may affect human health. The first one is wealth. So the poor are less able to afford housing and other infrastructure that can withstand extreme events and less likely to have access to medical care. The second one is education. So with education, we can learn how to avoid or reduce many impacts. When populations include professionals trained in hazards, then these people can help the populations with their hazard preparations and responses. The third is governance. Government can advance policies that reduce vulnerability. They can support education and awareness efforts as well as economic development to reduce poverty. They can foster social networks and empower individuals and communities to help themselves to prepare for and respond to hazards. The fourth one is technology. Technology can improve our ability to forecast extreme events, withstand the impact of events, and recover afterwards. Wealthier, more educated scientists are more likely to have more advanced technology. Number 5 is age. Children and the elderly tend to be more vulnerable. Okay. Why they are more vulnerable? It is because they have less physical strength to survive disasters and are often more susceptible to certain diseases. Last one is gender. Women are often more vulnerable to natural hazards than men. This is because women are likely to be poor, less educated, and politically marginalized, often due to sexism in societies around the world. Now let us proceed with the Philippine exposure and vulnerability to natural disasters. So 8 out of 10 cities most exposed to natural hazards are found in the Philippines. That is according to the Philippine Star issued 2014. Study also found that of the 100 cities greatest exposure to natural hazard, 21 are in the Philippines, 16 in China, 11 in Japan, and 8 in Bangladesh. So here are the 10 world cities that are most at risk or vulnerable to disasters. Let's find out the reason why the Philippines is vulnerable to natural disaster. One reason is the Philippines lie in Pacific typhoon belt and we are visited by an average of 20 typhoons every year. Another reason is because of the rugged nature of our landscape that makes our communities very vulnerable to landslides, mud flows, and other disasters. Another one is the Philippines is an archipelagic country with many small islands. These islands are surrounded by many bodies of water, which is one of the factors or ingredient in typhoon formation. Many of our areas are also at below sea level, with one of the longest in the world at 32,400 kilometers. We have many areas that are vulnerable to storm surges. Natural hazard risk is compounded in the Philippines by poor institutional and social capacity to manage, respond, and recover from natural hazard events. The Philippines is considered a high risk in terms of the country's ability to manage and mitigate the impacts of natural hazard, and in part due to entrenched corruption and high levels of poverty. Aside from being at risk to typhoons, the Philippines is also at risk to volcanic quakes and the floods. So that's the end of lesson 2, exposure and vulnerability. Thank you.